However, the wiring is in a state where we could start the car. So, let's make some noise. Welcome back to the channel, guys. Today we want to talk about the brakes on our 2014 Mustang. We shared with you in the last video that I've always wanted a fastback Mustang with a big block Chevy in it, and we introduced that to you last week. One of the things that we discovered when tearing into the car is the previous assembler had put a floor-mounted pedal in the car with this master cylinder. With some very quick math, we realized that in order to get the brake pressure that we need to stop the car, we would have to exert an extreme amount of force onto this pedal. This pedal at a maximum can only get about a 5.5 to 1 ratio. And when you combine that with the cross-sectional area of the piston size, you would have to put about 250 pounds of force onto this pedal in order to get the braking force that you need here at the calipers. I don't know how they even assembled this thing.
You had to put the reservoir on back afterwards?
I think so. When we received the car, the master cylinder was down here. The pedal assembly pushed and the push rod was in this area. And what made it particularly strange is that these lines came through here and it had residual pressure valves on this side of the frame. They just bored holes right through here. We don't install things that way. We prefer to have them hung on the firewall, and that way it'll gravity bleed and you don't have to have any residual pressure valves. But our biggest concern was the fact that the master cylinder and the pedal ratio didn't match, so that would have been very uncomfortable to drive if you got into a difficult circumstance where you had to panic brake. So what we prefer to do is utilize the factory style brake pedal assembly. This has a 4 to 1 ratio because it normally has a power booster here, and this allows a much softer feel on the pedal to get the same amount of push rod force going against the piston in the master cylinder, because you have a brake booster system that helps apply the force to generate the pressure. The stock pedal assembly is made of plastic. We want to be able to add reinforcements here in steel to make sure that the plastic doesn't break and still take advantage of the pedal assembly's return spring and the stoplight. When applying the force on the push rod to the piston, the amount of pressure that builds is directly correlated to the square inches that the piston diameter creates with the bore diameter. A good rule of thumb when sizing your master cylinder is to have 150 pounds of force on your brake pedal to equate to 1,000 psi line pressure.
Alright guys, Calvin here. I'm going to pause my dad here for a second and just lay out the two scenarios that he is about to go over. Scenario 1 is we keep the existing pedal ratio, in which case we have to convert to a different master cylinder bore diameter. And scenario 2 is we keep the master cylinder that came with the car, in which case we got to change to a different pedal ratio. So he's going to take you through the math and figure out which one will be best.
We have two scenarios here. If we want to keep 150 with the existing 4 to 1 ratio, you're going to generate 600 pounds of force on the push rod divided by the 1,000 pounds of line pressure. You come up with 0.6. That calculates basically out to a 7/8 bore master cylinder. On the 1 1/8 you would need a 6.6 to 1 ratio to calculate out and have the same pedal feel and the same line pressure. One of the risks that you have with sizing your master cylinder is you have to be very aware of the swept volume, and that swept volume translates to piston movement down in your calipers. If you don't have enough swept volume, you can't apply the force. Ideally, in a hydraulic system, everything's going to be a 1-to-1 ratio, but you're going to have to be very cognizant of that.
I'm going to pause my dad here again. Basically, what he's talking about is for a given amount of pedal travel, there should be a given amount of volume of fluid that moves. This is obviously a function of your pedal ratio, and in both scenarios, we are getting basically the same amount of volume that moves through the system for that 7 inches of pedal travel. Therefore, it is sort of a preference of whether you would rather change the pedal ratio or change the master cylinder. And as you'll see and hear in a second, we decided to go with the smaller bore master cylinder, a 7/8 bore.
We wanted to take advantage of the existing 4-to-1 ratio, utilizing the original bolt configuration and push rod location. Had we moved the pivot point on the pedal to make it a 6.6 to 1 ratio, the center of the push rod would be all the way up here in the middle of between these 2 points, but about 3/8 of an inch above this existing hole. Then you'd have to arc this out, and if you notice, this master cylinder pattern is not symmetric. It's actually rotated and shifted. So we wanted to avoid that, and again, it led us back to the 7/8 bore Chrysler master cylinder. I collected for years the Dodge Caravan master cylinders, and we found years ago that the M39736 Dorman master cylinder worked perfect. This is the second part of our Mustang build, and we wanted to share with you where we're at. One of the things that we needed to make sure we got taken care of was the brakes, but before you do the brakes, you need to make sure that you got the seat in place, and that allows you to get the steering done. And then you can set your pedals, and once you have your pedals in place, then you can put your brake master cylinder on and start running your lines. For you folks that have been following our channel for a while, you know that I was in a pretty bad crash, and we've been very committed over the years to building our cars safely, building strong roll bars, well designed, easy in, easy out. And one of the things we make a lot of focus with is how we mount our seats. If you take a look, all of the attachment points on this seat tie back to the roll cage, and that's important. Sheet metal can tear away or buckle and turn and loosen your belts, and the roll cage will keep you firmly in place relative to where your crash protection is for your body. When we got the car, this bar was actually straight down. This bar was at a strange angle. We cut all that out and put a replacement bar in, which allows for the driver to be better protected, and also allows us the use of the full containment seat. The full containment seat is needed in many forms of racing, and I was very fortunate that I had the funny car cage on the Volvo when it rolled over, and we had it positioned that it kept my head from moving around. Plus I had a Hans device. We will have a Hans device on this also, but it's got this head restraint that we use whenever we use an 850 cage on a fast car. We prefer to have the full containment seats. In land speed racing, they have more stringent rules on what kind of seat you have and making sure that the driver stays safe. You have to have a full window net. You have to have a full containment seat, and especially one that offers this rib support and shoulder support to keep you contained. In addition to that, you get above certain speeds, you're also required to have arm restraints. And had I had arm restraints in the Volvo crash, I would not have had the shoulder injuries that I had. It was very clear in the pictures that as I was going for the parachute and the car started to roll, I was never able to get my arms tucked in, and that's why the 3 muscles ripped off my shoulder. These are all things that you need to take into consideration when you're building a car that's going to serve as the basis for multiple sanctioning bodies, and we hope to have this car go very fast someday. When we received the car, if you recall in the last episode, we talked about how the steering rack was very far forward and the Ackerman angle was just a train wreck. The steering pickup points were in a bad location. So we reconfigured all of that, and once we had the roll bar changed, we had to get the doors to function. They didn't close. We modified the hinges. The doors now closed. Then we brought the roll bar out so that we could put the full containment seat in, which allowed us then to put on the steering column. We had to move that over. One of the things that works very well is this firewall bulkhead that serves as a bearing point for the whole shaft, and we were able to simplify the steering system to just have 2 universals, and everything is well supported. So this is going to work out really nice with repurposing most of the parts that came with it. We had to get the bulkhead fitting, real nice setup, real lightweight, everything's chrome moly, strange disconnect. It's got a register here so that it only goes on straight. Real nice stuff.
Alright guys, the next thing that we need to talk about is the wiring. Now a lot of you have probably noticed these ignition coils here on the valve cover throughout this video and the previous one. And if you didn't know, This is not standard for a big block Chevy of this type. Normally these engines come with a distributor, and you have a bunch of wires running down to the spark plugs, and you only have one ignition coil. My dad wanted to change to a coil on plug type setup, where there is one ignition coil for every cylinder, for a lot of the benefits that come from that. The benefits for doing this are you can get more spark energy without having to work your ignition coil quite as hard. When you're doing a distributor setup, you're having to fire that ignition coil 8 times as much as if you have 8 ignition coils, obviously. Another benefit of this particular setup is you can change the ignition timing for each cylinder. This means that you could be giving cylinder number 1 a little bit less timing than cylinder number 5, for example. You may look at your spark plugs and say, wow, this one's dead on the money for ignition timing, but you look at another plug and it's like, that's a little aggressive. So you can sort of do some cylinder to cylinder tuning. And since we do intend to put a pretty serious nitrous setup onto this engine at some point, that will probably come in handy in the future. Obviously, if you look right here, the car is running a carburetor. So there are no fuel injectors in this system. I actually have a plug back here so that if we do eventually want to put injectors on the car and run it on EFI, we can do that in the future. But for the time being, it will be spark only, and the fuel will be provided by the carburetor. This is quite easy to do with any fuel injected base computer. So let's move on to the interior and we'll talk about that. Before we move on to the interior, I want to talk about what we are using in place of the distributor. Now, normally with a coil on plug conversion, most people would put an external trigger wheel onto the front of the engine and put some sort of cam sync onto either the front of the cam or something in the distributor. However, Holley has actually come out with a pretty good product to make that a lot easier. What we are running here is called a Holley dual sync distributor, and basically what it does is it generates a cam and a crank signal for your ECU to use. Basically it has an 8-tooth wheel that it uses for the crank sensor and a 1-tooth wheel that it uses for the cam sensor. Now you got to remember that this spins at half the crankshaft speed, so that 8-tooth wheel that is spinning around in there acts like a 4-tooth wheel for something that if you would have installed it onto the crankshaft. So when you are setting up your ignition settings and fuel settings in the computer, you got to remember to set it up as 4 teeth, otherwise the ECU will get confused. Now normally these distributors come with a cap that has connections so that you can run wires down to each of your cylinders, because it is intended to do ignition timing control on a distributor style setup with a single ignition coil. However, they also sell caps to eliminate that cap and just sort of blank off the top of this for guys that are running EFI. Their caps are like $70, and I didn't feel like paying that for it, so I 3D printed this little cap to sort of eliminate the distributor style cap, and I'm pretty happy with how that turned out. Now, a lot of people may not realize that this is just a trigger setup. It's no different than any other trigger setup. You do not have to use a Holley ECU in conjunction with a Holley dual sync. You can run any ECU you want, so let's move on to the interior and talk about that. Moving on to the interior of the car, what you will notice right off the bat is we are running a Mega Squirt Gold Box. Now a lot of you might be saying, I thought that was for controlling fuel injection. Well, what you guys may not know is you can use any EFI computer to just control the ignition. You just don't hook the fuel injectors up. As far as the computer knows, everything is hunky-dory. It's just sending outputs to things that don't exist. So the reason that we chose to go with a Megasquirt Gold box is we happen to have one laying around, but also it has enough spark outputs to do full sequential control. We can do individual cylinder tuning, and it will allow us to do some more fancy features in the future, like traction control, which is something we want to explore with this car. Next, I want to talk about the sort of power distribution on the car. And we are using something called a Link ECU Razor PDM. And we've partnered up with the guys over at Link ECU, and they hooked us up with this PDM. Now, normally, I'm not really a fan of PDMs, but I think I've found a pretty clever use case for one of these units. In most cases, the PDMs seem to be very expensive, and I almost would rather have a fuse and relay just because I can go to any auto parts store in the country and get a fuse or relay. In the case of a PDM, if the box fails, you got to replace the entire box. And as I said, they're not cheap. However, I think we have found a very good use case for this PDM that will make it worth its cost. And that is to control the nitrous. And one of your greatest fears with a nitrous car is losing the wire on your fuel solenoid and spraying only nitrous into the engine on a wet nitrous setup. In the case of a fuel solenoid failure, what will happen is you are still getting fuel from your carburetor that is tuned to run the engine NA, but you're also still getting your nitrous into the engine, and this will cause an ultra lean mixture which will burn up any engine very, very fast. Now, what the PDM provides to us is with the high current outputs in the PDM, it is constantly measuring the current output for that output. And you can write custom logic based on what that current reading is. You could write things that say, hey, if my fuel solenoid output current goes to near 0 amps, shut the nitrous solenoid off. Or let's say we have a high current trip on the fuel solenoid. Shut the nitrous solenoid off. So rather than like just popping a fuse in your nitrous system or having an issue that is undetectable, like breaking a wire, what this system will allow us to do is say, hey, the fuel's not spraying, shut it off. And I think this will be worth its weight in gold because it's a lot cheaper to have one of these boxes in your car than to fix a burnt up set of pistons. Also, those high current outputs are solid state, so we should have the ability to do a progressive shot of nitrous with those outputs. So I'm really excited to play with this PDM more. I think this is an excellent use case for what we are doing. And who knows, I might fall in love with it and we might start putting them on everything. Now, the wiring still has quite a bit of a ways to go. You can see a lot of the connections are not quite hooked up yet, but I'll get to that. However, the wiring is in a state where we could start the car. So let's make some noise. Now, with any startup, there's usually a little bit of trial and error. Sometimes you gotta play with the settings and set the ignition timing, test your outputs. In this case, I had to try a couple different options for what to set my ignition settings to. And it didn't go back the other way. It backfired through the exhaust. And it took a little bit of trial and error.
Poor John.
Never had to do that before.
Poor John. Hit it.
And advance. But we eventually got it, and voila, we have a 525 cubic inch big block Chevy in a fastback Mustang that runs. Alright guys, like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.